Between the 1960s and the 1990s, the incarceration rate in this country skyrocketed some 400%, far outpacing any other industrialized democracy. And for some time since, scholars have so thought they understood why that happened that it's become almost an unquestioned truth. But are truths always true? Turns out to be something of a whodunnit, actually, with the principal detective being my guest today. Joining me from Cornell University is Peter Enns. Peter is an associate professor in the Department of Government, is the executive director of the Roper Center for Public Opinion Research, as well as the author of the just-published book, Incarceration Nation: How the United States Became the Most Punitive Democracy in the World. Welcome to Wide Angle, Peter.
Thank you very much.
Let's start off with just a little bit of a disclaimer. I want my viewers to understand that the book does not have an agenda. That the voice is that of a social scientist who's interested in looking at and understanding a phenomenon. In this case, the dramatic rise in incarceration in the U.S. between the 60s and the 90s. There was no intention to either support or condemn incarceration per se. Do I have a correct read on that?
Yeah, well, thanks for noticing that, Peter. What I wanted to understand why the U.S. has the highest incarceration rate in the world, and certainly it's stunning that is the case, but why that happened, I really went in and looked at the data and let the data speak. And so in terms of a preconceived notion, yeah, I didn't go in with expectations. I had some ideas, but I wasn't searching for a particular answer.
The standard explanation for that is that during those 4 decades, the punitive leanings and policies of Republican politicians were what led that rise. Starting back in the mid-60s with Barry Goldwater's presidential campaign and leading to Nixon and thereafter. You doubted that explanation. Why? What led you to doubt what sort of had come to be an accepted explanation in the field?
Sure. Well, I went in and the view of these politicians leading the way, that surprised me because it seemed to me, why were these politicians, why would they be doing that? And so it got me looking at public opinion. And public opinion turns out to be a missing part of the story if we want to understand the criminal justice system in the United States.
Okay, so I guess if it's not politicians, if it's not politicians bent on punishing criminals, as it were, the question would be, what was going on? Who or what was it that led to this rise in incarceration?
Yeah, and I think what we really need to do, and we can unpack in this conversation, is politicians were an important part of this. So political decisions changed how we punish criminals in this country. And so what I mean by that, we're talking about mandatory minimum sentences, the length of sentences changing, and how specific crimes are punished. And those are political decisions. But the question I was interested in with the book is, why did the political leaders make these choices? Why did the political system respond in a way that had such a dramatic effect on the criminal justice system? And to get to that level of understanding, that's where the public comes in. And not just public opinion in general, but what we've got to do is look at changes in public opinion. And that's an aspect of the literature and what previous researchers haven't fully explored, is how over year after year, over the history since the 1950s in this country, public attitudes have changed.
One of your unique contributions to this field, yes, is a new way of looking at the data that's surrounded us for some time. So for instance, I think as you write, it was that public opinion would have been used in, like the Gallup poll, yeah? And I think one of the questions that was drawn on frequently to register the public's feelings about crime and punishment was something like this: what do you think is the most important problem facing the country today? So it was a very time-specific, singular question. Your sense was that something so simplistic, in a sense, really lost a lot of information that would be central to figuring out what it is the American public felt about crime and punishment. So what did you introduce to your research that was qualitatively different than what preceded it?
Sure. So yeah, this most important problem question that you described, so if a lot of the public says crime is the most important problem, that would seem like a really good indicator of how concerned the public is with crime. But the problem is there's other things that matter too. So imagine the country going into an economic recession. So more of the public start mentioning the economy as the most important problem. So that means fewer individuals will say crime's the most important problem, but maybe crime is a growing concern too, just not growing as much as the economy. So this survey question, while important, it can lead to some kind of confusing patterns in public opinion. So to get around that, I looked at various questions, in fact, almost 40 different public opinion questions. So attitudes toward the death penalty, attitudes towards sentencing, should we be spending more on prisons and the criminal justice system? And each of these questions I looked at were asked repeatedly over time. The earliest questions in the early 50s, and then all the way to the most recent years. And so what this gives us is instead of measuring whether the public is saying crime is an important issue, I'm able to tap directly into whether the public's getting tougher on crime or more punitive, or moving in the opposite direction, getting less extreme on crime, moving in a more rehabilitative direction. And so I'm able to, by combining almost 40 survey questions asked repeatedly, hundreds of times, we get an indication of whether the public is becoming more or less punitive in this country.
Certainly, the media figures into this whodunit, as I laid it out from the start. And there really is a causal chain that you sort of draw out in the book. It does not start with punitive politicians, but as you say, they certainly are involved in the causal chain. But the chain actually starts back with the actual crime rate. Am I right? Surprising, actually, hopefully not surprisingly, but sort of surprisingly.
Yeah, given conventional wisdom and most of the scholarly literature, the influence of the crime rate I've found is very surprising. And it turns out that, as I mentioned, when crime goes up, we get more media coverage of crime, and that's driving the public punitiveness. But this is not necessarily a straightforward or expected pattern.
Right. So it starts, I think, as sort of laid out, it starts with crime rates going up, media covering them, therefore, more. And then the next player in that causal chain is actually you and I. It's the public, yes?
That's right. And the reason that when you say it like that, Peter, it seems very intuitive. The reason that's surprising is if we look at any single time point, we know media doesn't give an accurate portrayal of the crimes being committed. So violent crimes are overreported in the media, crimes committed by racial minorities are overreported, and the public actually, because of that, overestimates how much violent crime there is. So it seems like there's no connection, that there's a lot of error introduced into the news reporting and public assessments. That's true. But if we want to understand why the incarceration rate in this country increased so much, we need to look at what's going on over time. And that's where things start to make sense. Even though these biases exist in reporting, when the crime rate goes up, we get more coverage of crime, and that's what the public is noticing. That's what's leading to the increase in punitiveness.
Okay, all right. Speaking of media coverage, certainly to me one of the more interesting aspects of the book was talking about crime reporting, and I think, like all journalistic style, it adopts what is called an episodic frame, right? So it focuses on the particulars of a crime rather than the context, because the journalist, I suppose, would then be perceived of inserting his or her own biases. Yeah. So it's just the facts, ma'am, just the facts. However, just the facts leaves the reading public with a particular impression. Is that right?
Yeah, and it is just the facts, but it's certain facts. And so as we often hear the "if it bleeds, it leads" saying in terms of reporting on crime, and that's exactly right. And that's why we get an overemphasis on violent crimes and such a focus on the particulars of the crime. But there is a broader context that often doesn't get into the news stories. So how much crime is there? Is this an anomalous crime or is this a typical crime? We also tend not to get the context of what policies are most likely to reduce crime or what types of sentences might have the largest deterrent effect. So there's this really large and important context that's missing. So it's not the case that all news reporting has to lead to more punitive attitudes, but the episodic framing you're mentioning, that's why if there's more coverage of crime in the news, we tend to see more punitive attitudes within the mass public.
Very good. We're going to take just a quick break here, Peter, but we'll be right back. Please join us.
If you live in one of the 22 communities that appear on your screen now, you likely belong to the Mystic River Watershed. This vital resource is a natural living system that we all share. Since 1972, the Mystic River Watershed Association has successfully fought to protect and restore this treasure. Now I'm asking you to join that effort. Please go to mysticriver.org to become a member and to find out how you can help today.
Welcome back to Wide Angle. I'm Peter Bermudez, talking with Peter Enns from Cornell University, talking about his book, Incarceration Nation. Peter, let's pick up sort of where we left off before the break. And we were talking about episodically framed stories from the media. And just I have a conundrum, and that is this. To whom does the responsibility, if we know that episodically framed stories have a certain impact on the public, to perhaps become more agitated, more anxious about a rise in crime, as opposed to sort of providing a frame and a context for it to understand it and perhaps feel a little bit more understanding of the circumstances that the crime comes from. Who does the responsibility for that fall to? Does it fall to journalists if they know that episodically framed, and I wonder if they do, episodically framed stories tend to ratchet up a concern that maybe there need not be for? Does it fall to we as consumers of media and stories to know that these stories are typically just the facts, they're episodically framed, and we need to become more sophisticated consumers of the media so that we understand, okay, this is lacking context. I need to try and understand the context before I have a reaction to it. Do you have a sense? This is really outside, certainly outside the project of the book, but if you have a comment, because I imagine you've thought about it.
Yeah, and Peter, I think the easy answer is everyone holds some responsibility, but we should drill down a little deeper in that. And I think one thing that media and journalists, now it's challenging because they're competing for viewers or competing for an audience on the internet or newspaper circulation, and of course there's financial concerns, but I think there's a responsibility to think through the bigger picture. And again, if there's a crime and it's reported in a very sensationalistic way, there's other aspects of the judicial system or the context or why certain crimes might be committed that need to be kept in mind. And so one example to think about is imperfections in the judicial system. So there's been some stories, especially more recently, about individuals on death row, and even some who have been executed who are later found innocent and exonerated. And I don't think it's that the public isn't interested in those stories. I think that there's a responsibility that that's part of any crime reporting or any reporting about the judicial system, and that media needs to make sure those stories get in the mix. So it's not about not reporting about crime, but making choices that a broad enough context is provided and essentially an accurate representation of the overall picture. And I think the public needs to be aware and needs to be attentive, but my sense is that the public is interested in those stories, and it's important that they're provided.
Okay. Back to the the skyrocketing of the incarceration rate. I suppose it would be of some consolation if we were able to say that these high incarceration rates actually reduced crime and made us as a public safer. But in fact, not surprisingly, they didn't make us safer. They didn't reduce crime. In fact, there's research that suggests that such high levels of incarceration actually encouraged or led to a rise in criminal behavior. I guess number one is, how would that happen? And number two is, from a dollar for dollar standpoint, what are more effective ways of reducing crime from a statistical standpoint?
There's a few important points you mentioned there, Peter. So one is the dollar for dollar aspect. And almost all researchers, whether we're talking about political scientists like myself or economists, sociologists, historians, agree that dollar for dollar, the level of incarceration in this country is not the most cost-effective way to reduce crime. And the reason is, well, there's a couple reasons. One, it's incredibly expensive to maintain the world's highest incarceration rate. And so this money is going toward incarcerating individuals instead of policies and programs that might better reduce crime. So some of that is just money towards policing and more police patrols, but also social programs, whether it's job training, education, improving schools, improving health options, mental health options. And so researchers agree that the money could be better spent. Another consideration is the research suggests that long prison sentences don't have a deterrent effect. So 5 years versus 10 years versus 25 years, that is not deterring crime. But what it is doing is it's putting individuals in prison for longer, which of course costs more, as I mentioned. But it also means upon release, if somebody's been in prison for 20 years, think about any individual being without a job for a year or 2 years, just because they lost a job. Getting back in the job market is a huge challenge. Now imagine 20 years in prison without education opportunities, without job training opportunities, with the stigma some employers attach to a criminal record and a prison record. Think of how much harder that is. And then that, of course, relates to recidivism and increased crime rates there. The other factor is there's evidence that spending a lot of time in a closed environment with a lot of people with criminal backgrounds has this type of criminogenic effect you described, where the probability of committing a crime after release increases because of the prison sentence.
Right. Right. And actually, I was thinking in terms of the cost related to incarceration. I think it was off of the prison education program's website, which we'll get to in a little bit. It suggested that the cost of incarcerating a single person in upstate New York for a year is around $60,000. So I think that's a tuition at an elite university. Yeah, essentially.
Yeah.
For a dollar standpoint. The ways in which we are getting our news nowadays has, in the past decade or so, has changed dramatically from the way, as a child, I saw my parents getting their news. It goes without saying to a certain extent, and yet the subtleties and the nuances perhaps are sometimes lost. So what are the changes that we've seen in terms of how it is that we're getting our information, and how might those changes actually pave the way to further reforms in the prison system?
Changes in the media environment are really important because, as we discussed, in Incarceration Nation, I draw the link between crime shifts, media shifts, and the public's punitiveness, and then how that impacts our incarceration rate. But in the most recent years, as you mentioned, Peter, the media environment has changed radically. So not only do we have the proliferation of cable programming and news options, and this of course relates to late night comedy shows providing the news, but then of course the internet, individuals getting the news from Facebook, even Twitter, 140 characters. And so what this means is news is highly targeted to individuals, and individuals can select the news. Sometimes we don't even realize that it's being targeted to us. So if we check Facebook, that Facebook has an algorithm in the background targeting stories that this algorithm thinks will be more likely to click on. And what this means for criminal justice reform and public opinion is a bit of an open question. Are these targeted stories mean that people's views will be reinforced and will drive their views in a more solidified way? Or will the varied options mean there's a chance for more diverse opinions? And so this is an open and important question.
Yeah, sort of the Pandora effect. I'm hearing the same music that I've liked before.
Absolutely. Or will we bump into somebody else who got a very different story instead of everybody having the same newspapers or the same 3 television programs?
Although certainly some challenging news to sort of digest. Certainly the general feeling is, I think, if I read it properly, is an electorate, a public that feels somewhat disenfranchised, somewhat disempowered, not being listened to by their representatives, by the powers that be, if you will. This news strikes me as possibly some sunshine, that even if we are not supportive of the rise in incarceration that we witnessed from the 60s to the 90s, that the public being listened to and being in a position where politicians listened to them and then enacted legislation that ultimately led to a rise in crime is actually sort of a good thing. Should I be happy about that?
Yeah, this story is a bit of a double-edged sword, because we often hear politicians don't listen to people like me. They're only interested in what big business wants or what the wealthy want. And so we think in a representative democracy like the United States, what the public wants, what voters want, politicians should pay attention to. Here we have an instance where that happened. We see over recent history, criminal justice policy has reflected changes in the public's opinion. The result is the highest incarceration rate in the world, with profound economic costs, social costs, and as we discussed earlier, really limited and contingent effects on crime reduction. And so we've got a pretty problematic outcome as a result of the representative process. So it's a double-edged sword in that sense.
Yeah. Working as you do in the field of public opinion, do you sense, if we are to take the positive from this, and because public opinion can have an impact, do you have a sense as to what the most powerful ways might be that we can communicate as individuals, as collective bodies, our opinions to our representatives to help guide them and inform them about what it is that we want to see happen?
Thinking about now and moving forward, this is an important part of the story. And the reason I say that is since the late 90s, the crime rate has been coming down and media coverage of crime has been declining. And so what we see is the public has been moving in a less punitive direction. And so I think we're at a potentially critical juncture here, because since the public's been moving in a less punitive direction, we're beginning to see more and more evidence of a political response. And so in terms of how to translate the public will to what happens with the criminal justice system, I think it matters more which way the public goes than how it tries to get its voice across. And so if the public continues to move in a less punitive direction, I think we can expect further evidence of reforms within the criminal justice system.
Is there anything else, Peter, that we haven't spoken of today that you feel would be valuable for viewers to know about crime and punishment, as it were, the rise in incarceration, public opinion, or something else?
Well, I think what I'll emphasize is, as I mentioned, the public's been moving in a less punitive direction. And as a result, we see prominent Democrats and prominent Republicans calling for criminal justice reform. And so I think what we have to keep in mind is, one, what is the crime rate going to do in the coming years? But more importantly, how will media cover the crime rate? And if media shifts a little bit away from the episodic frame we talked about and takes a more thematic, contextual approach, then we could expect public opinion to either stay the same or even continue in this less punitive direction. And with the criminal justice and the legal system, as the public goes, so goes the system and the incarceration rate. So public opinion will continue to matter, and how media covers the crime rate will be an important indicator of which way the public's going.
Very good. Well, I thank you very much, Peter, for joining me today, taking the time to talk with me, and also for the time that you contributed. You focused on the book in sort of yielding a very different picture from one that we had understood before.
Well, Peter, thanks for having me. Really enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you. We have been led to believe, by subtle means, if not explicit statements, that public opinion holds little sway at the State House and on Capitol Hill. And I've been enough of a cynic to believe that's true. But the research of Peter Enns suggests otherwise. The downside of this news flash is that we're back on the hook, unable to any longer spare ourselves the arduous work of democracy on the grounds that it won't matter anyway. The upside, of course, is that perhaps we can make a difference. We'll not deceive ourselves, much remains to be done. But just perhaps, enough remains of our democracy to work with and build on. If incarceration concerns you, go for it. And if it's some other issue, then by all means. But let's not allow our silence to be the voice of complicity. On behalf of Peter Enns, I'm Peter Bermudez. Thank you for joining us for this edition of Wide Angle.